Something is happening to hip-hop. I think it started back in 2023 when we got the JPEG and Danny Brown collab album, Scaring the Hoes. Both pretty big artists before that, jpegmafia being the little more underground, experimental artist. And Danny Brown being much bigger of a name, but also kind of known for not being afraid to get wacky and do some really weird collabs. But the success and critical acclaim of this album was super unexpected for an experimental album, let alone something this experimental. Like, JPEG's production style is not very radio friendly. It is actually about as far from that as I can imagine.
That was Perfect by Ed Sheeran. And next up, we have one of my personal favorites, Lean Beef Patty by jpegmafia and Danny Brown.
First off, fuck Elon Musk, 8,000 too much, this that's expensive. Put a hose in the back and a crack in the slack, my teeth in the leak and I meant it.
It was a lot of people's first experience with either artist, and first experience with anything like this at all. Even if you were a big fan of JPEG before this album, I wouldn't even consider his other stuff close to as experimental as this album was, so it was a shock for fans of both. I know for me personally, I was a fan of Danny Brown, but not huge into JPEG, and this album completely changed that. And looking back at Scaring the Hoes now, I genuinely think this is one of those albums that people will look back at and think, that's where it started. That's where hip-hop got crazy. If you think back to how mainstream hip-hop was in the years prior, while there was some great stuff coming out, it all kind of felt like it was stagnating a bit. Like the old huge goats of the genre, your Kanye's, your Drake's, Kid Cudi's, have all kind of been falling from grace in one way or another, and fallen into this hole of just making pretty stale music, at least compared to their earlier stuff, which had a significant impact on the genre. And you could say that's just age, which definitely could be the case for people like Drake and Kid Cudi, but I started noticing a trend that the biggest and best hip-hop albums by younger artists would fall into this certain sound that I'd call Kanye-core. Open to better names if you have one. But basically, the biggest and best sounding hip-hop albums would all sound very inspired by different Kanye West sounds, and I'm aware that a lot of modern hip-hop is inspired by Kanye West in some way or another, and the influence is unavoidable, but this stuff kind of felt like a full circle kind of revisiting of the same sound, like not a byproduct of it, but more just mimicking it, almost like there was an opening in the market, given the absence of revolutionary Kanye stuff coming out, and people either consciously or subconsciously tried to recreate it. Stuff like Baby Keem's Melodic Blue, which is a record I love, by the way, but I love it because I love 808s and Heartbreak, and a lot of the album's sounds are very obviously inspired by it, some tracks even sampling it. He said himself that 808s is one of his favorite albums and biggest influences, and you can tell. So as much as I love that album and think it's great, I'm way more stoked to see what his next stuff sounds like when he experiments a little more in finding his own sound beyond his influences. And then there's stuff like Travis Scott's latest album, Utopia, which felt kind of like he's completed his metamorphosis of sounding like a combination of Kid Cudi and Kanye West. I mean, the album is undeniably Kanye influenced throughout.
Bible. I like a bi girl on a bicycle.
And as technically good as it is, really showed, to me at least, just how much this sound from 15 years ago is still being emulated as the sort of peak of hip-hop. And I know some of the tracks were literally almost Kanye tracks, but he could have done something to make it a little more his own. So it was at this point that I realized, you know what? I'm tired of this sound. I know that Kanye has gone off the deep end and there's a sort of void that people think needs to be filled by Kanye-esque music, but I think it's time we let it go and someone else make the next 808s and Heartbreak or Yeezus that will influence more artists for the next 15 years. And after seeing the success of Scaring the Hoes, I think a lot of people felt the same way. Fast forward to 2025, and now we're seeing stuff like Jane Remover's recent releases. Yes, I feel the need to mention her in any video I can. She's one of my favorite artists right now, okay? But her whole career has been turn after turn into different sounds and experimentation. And to my surprise, after releasing a complete shoegaze album, she's now been releasing stuff with this sort of hip-hop sound that kind of broke my brain when I first heard it. I was a little hesitant to call it a form of hip-hop at first, but the inspirations and similarities to stuff like rage rap is pretty evident. Then her latest single comes out and it is straight up undeniably hip-hop, but like not. Suddenly this hyperpop, then shoegaze artist is making some of the most refreshing experimental hip-hop I've heard in years. Crazy timing, too. After Playboi Carti delayed his album for over a year at this point, only for him and all of Opium to get upstaged by Jane in one track. Maybe Carti knew that something was happening in the scene, something was changing, and he had to rework his whole album from the ground up. 2024 music, am I right? Which, speaking of Carti, you could also kind of give him some of the credit for kind of steering us towards this path with Whole Lotta Red back in 2020.
Jump out the house, jump out the house, jump out the house, jump out that bitch. Jump out that bitch.
Which now seems like a pretty standard rage rap album, but for the time and for how big of a trap artist he was at that time, this was a huge leap in sound that a lot of people weren't ready for. And we're at a point now where I don't know if we'd have current Jane Remover stuff without a Whole Lotta Red coming out and pushing that boundary. I can only wonder what kind of stuff is going to come out 2-3 years from now when bigger and bigger artists are releasing crazy stuff inspired by scaring the hoes. I'm not saying I expect someone like Kendrick to make some crazy experimental stuff like jpegmafia, but there are certain big artists that I could totally see making the jump in the future. People like Denzel Curry, Tyler the Creator, Doechii, maybe. There's certain artists that are just always pushing boundaries no matter what. It's just part of what fundamentally drives them as an artist. Tyler probably being the most mainstream that I could think of. Dude has made an entire career out of being weird, but not trying to. Just being his authentically weird self. That's why even in his 30s now, he's still so huge with young people, because authenticity is attractive. Not in a like, he's hot sense, but you know, like a magnetic trait. Then there's also Doechii, who has had this huge blow up recently for good reason. When I first heard her album from last year, I was blown away by how creative it is, and as much as I don't see it happening, a jpegmafia collab would go insane. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying I think classic hip-hop is going anywhere. I think people like Kendrick Lamar are proving constantly that you can push the classic roots of the genre to its limits without needing some crazy experimental production. And same with Doechii, who I am wholeheartedly convinced at this point is going to be the next GOAT after Kendrick without even needing this crazy production. But we're definitely entering a new era of hip-hop, an era where being yourself and doing whatever the hell you want is cool. You want to make something that sounds like 5 beats mashed together? Hell yeah. The genre has been mainstream for a while now, and I think people are starting to get tired of everyone playing by the rules and sticking to the same sound. It's something that happens to every genre that's mainstream. It's only a matter of time before people start creating an edgier, more experimental version of the genre, and then that version slowly seeps into the mainstream stuff, and then people start getting tired of that. It goes on forever. We've just witnessed this with hyperpop being the sort of experimental answer to mainstream pop, only to get so popular that mainstream pop wants in, starts dabbling with the sound, and then people get tired of it. So maybe one day someone like Tyler or Kendrick Lamar, somebody big, will make something that sounds like Scaring the Hoes or Jane Remover's new stuff, and people will get tired of it. But for now, it's pretty sick, and it makes me excited for the future of the genre. Let me know in the comments if I missed anyone else that's doing this, because I always miss someone and realize the second I hit publish. But that's the video. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, feel free to leave a like, and if you really liked the video, hit the subscribe button, please. Okay, bye.